Winter arrived early in Red Hollow, laying a pale frost over empty tracks and promises that had long since lost their meaning. Clara Bennett sat alone on a splintered wooden bench, her breath shallow in the biting air. She was 37, tall and slightly gaunt from weeks of strain, her once soft features now sharpened by exhaustion. Her dark brown hair, loosely tied at the nape of her neck, had strands slipping free, clinging to her pale, wind-chapped skin. Her coat stretched tightly over her swollen belly, a quiet, undeniable truth she could neither hide nor escape. Clara had always been the kind of woman who endured, gentle, patient, the sort who believed that if she gave enough of herself, life might one day return the favor. It never had. The train that brought her here was gone. So was the man who promised to build a life with her. His name lingered only as a dull ache, not worth repeating, not worth holding. Red Hollow was not a place for beginnings. It was where things ended quietly, without witness. The wind crept through the station like a living thing, whispering through broken boards and rattling a crooked sign that no longer told time correctly. Clara pressed a trembling hand against her belly as the child shifted within her, a small, stubborn reminder that she was not entirely alone. That truth felt heavier than comfort. Night settled without ceremony. The last light drained from the sky, leaving the world in a cold, endless gray. Clara stood slowly, her knees stiff, her body aching under the weight of both child and regret. She stepped toward the tracks, boots crunching softly against frozen gravel. There was a strange calm in her chest now, the kind that comes when fear has nothing left to protect. She closed her eyes. No prayers came, no memories worth holding her back, just silence. "Ma'am, don't choose a road that doesn't lead back." The voice was low, steady, carrying none of the urgency she expected, only quiet certainty. Clara turned. Jake Turner stood a few steps behind her, tall and broad-shouldered, his figure outlined by the dim lantern light. At 28, he carried himself with the stillness of someone older, shaped by years that had taught him to speak less and observe more. His face was angular, marked by a strong jaw shadowed with short, unkempt stubble, and wind-worn skin that hinted at long days under open skies. His dark blonde hair sat uneven beneath a weathered hat, and his eyes, calm, pale, unreadable, rested on her without judgment. There was something in the way he stood, grounded and unhurried, as if storms had passed through him before and found nothing left to take. Clara said nothing. For the first time that night, the silence shifted, not empty, not final, but waiting. The wind followed them out of the station like a stray thing unwilling to let go, curling around their boots as Clara walked beside Jake in silence, each step measured, uncertain, yet no longer drifting without direction. The road stretched thin across the frozen prairie, marked only by wagon tracks half buried in frost. Jake did not look at her as they walked, nor did he press her with questions. He moved with a quiet steadiness, one gloved hand resting loosely near the reins of a waiting mule tied just beyond the station. The animal, a stocky gray mule named Rusty, lifted its head as they approached, its coat thick and coarse, its dark eyes calm with the patience of a creature that had endured long winters without complaint. Jake untied the rope with practiced ease, his movements economical, shaped by years of doing things alone. Clara hesitated before climbing into the wagon, her body heavy, her thoughts heavier. She had followed a stranger into the dark, something she would have once called foolish, even dangerous. But there was no hunger in Jake's presence, no flicker of expectation in his eyes, only space, only quiet. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She settled onto the wooden seat, pulling her coat tighter, as the mule began its slow, deliberate walk. The wagon creaked forward, the sound stretching into the night like an old song remembered by no one. They traveled without words. Clara kept her gaze fixed ahead, watching the horizon dissolve into darkness, her mind circling the same fragile question. What did this man want? People did not offer shelter without reason. Not in places like Red Hollow, not in a world that had already taken more than it gave. Yet Jake did not try to fill the silence. He did not explain himself. He simply guided the mule, his posture relaxed but attentive, as though he trusted the road more than conversation. The cabin appeared slowly, almost reluctantly, rising from the pale emptiness of the land. It was small, built from rough timber weathered by years of wind and snow, its roof edged with frost and a faint thread of smoke curling from the chimney. Light glowed softly through a single window, steady and warm, like a promise that did not need to be spoken. Jake stepped down first, his boots landing firmly in the snow, then turned and offered a hand. Clara paused, studying him for a brief moment. This man with his quiet eyes and worn coat, who had asked for nothing and given everything so far. Then she placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, solid, grounding in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. Inside, the warmth wrapped around her immediately, pressing against the cold that had settled deep into her bones. The cabin was simple, but ordered, a stone hearth with a steady fire, a wooden table with two mismatched chairs, shelves lined with jars of preserved food, and a narrow bed tucked neatly into the corner. There were no unnecessary things, no signs of excess, only what was needed to live and perhaps to endure. Clara stepped further in, her boots leaving faint marks on the worn floor, her breath catching slightly as the heat touched her face. "You can take the bed," Jake said, already moving to set a kettle over the fire, his tone even, as if the decision required no discussion. "I'll take the chair." Clara shook her head instinctively. "I've slept in worse places." "Not tonight," he replied simply, without looking back, without force, but with a quiet finality that left no room for argument. She lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, her body trembling, not from cold this time, but from something softer, more unfamiliar. Relief, perhaps, or the weight of being somewhere she did not have to defend herself. Jake poured hot water into a tin cup, adding a pinch of dried herbs from a small cloth pouch, then handed it to her. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Clara felt the smallest flicker of something she quickly pushed aside. "I don't want to be a burden," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake met her gaze then, his expression unchanged, steady as ever. "You're not." "No more, no less." Clara looked down at the cup in her hands, the steam rising in soft curls, and for the first time since the train had left her behind, the world did not feel like it was slipping out from under her feet. Outside, the wind continued its restless song, but inside the cabin there was only the quiet crackle of fire and a fragile, unfamiliar sense that perhaps, just for tonight, she could stay. Morning came thin and gray, the kind that never fully warmed, as if the sun itself had chosen to keep its distance from Red Hollow. Clara stepped out of the cabin, wrapped in Jake's spare coat, the fabric heavy on her shoulders, carrying a faint scent of smoke and leather. The land stretched quiet around them, but beyond that quiet, the town waited, and it did not forget. Jake had said little when he asked if she wanted to ride in with him for supplies. Clara nodded, though something inside her tightened at the thought of being seen. The wagon rolled slowly into Red Hollow, its wooden wheels grinding against frozen dirt. Heads turned before they even reached the main street. It wasn't loud at first, just glances, quick and sharp, like birds watching something out of place. Clara kept her eyes forward, her posture straight despite the weight she carried. She had learned long ago that shrinking only made people look harder. Still, she could feel it, the attention pressing against her like cold wind through thin cloth. At the general store, the whispers found their voice. Martha Collins stood behind the counter, a woman in her late 50s with a sturdy build and tightly pinned gray hair that hadn't changed in decades. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her mouth, thin and often pursed, had a habit of shaping opinions before facts. She had lived in Red Hollow her whole life, widowed young, raising 3 sons who had all left as soon as they could. It had left her with a bitterness she wore like a second skin, a quiet judgment for anything that didn't fit the order she believed in. When Clara stepped inside, Martha's gaze swept over her once, lingering on her belly, then flicking to Jake. "Well," Martha said, her voice dry, carrying just enough volume to be overheard. "Didn't expect to see you settling down so suddenly, Jake." Jake removed his hat, brushing a hand through his wind-tangled hair, his expression unchanged. "Just here for flour and salt." Martha gave a soft hum, the kind that said more than words. "Of course you are." Behind Clara, a man near the shelves shifted, pretending not to listen. He was younger, maybe mid-30s, tall but slightly hunched, with a patchy beard and restless eyes that darted too quickly. Ben Harper had once tried his hand at ranching and failed after a harsh winter wiped out his cattle. Since then, he had made a habit of watching others, measuring their choices like they were his to judge. He's too young for that kind of trouble, Ben muttered, not quietly enough. Clara heard it. Of course she did. Each word landed clean, precise, like small cuts. Trouble. That was what she was now. Not a woman, not a person, just a complication with a heartbeat. Jake didn't turn. He didn't argue. He simply placed the items on the counter, counted out the coins, and said, "That all?" Martha nodded, sliding the goods toward him. "That's all." Outside, the cold air felt sharper. Clara walked ahead this time, her steps faster, uneven. By the time they reached the wagon, her chest felt tight, her thoughts louder than anything spoken in that store. She climbed in without waiting, gripping the edge of the seat as if it might steady something inside her. "They're right," she said suddenly, her voice low but strained. "About me." Jake tied the supplies down, his movements unhurried. "People talk. They don't talk like that unless it's true." She kept her eyes on the horizon, refusing to look at him. "You shouldn't be tied to this. To me." Jake climbed up beside her, the wood creaking under his weight. He took the reins, but didn't start the mule right away. "I wasn't tied to anything," he said. "I chose to be here." Clara shook her head, a quiet, defeated motion. "You don't understand what it costs." Jake glanced at her then, not long, but long enough. "Maybe I do." The wagon began to move, slow and steady, carrying them away from the town and its voices. But the words didn't stay behind. They followed, settling into the spaces between Clara's thoughts, repeating themselves in softer, sharper echoes. By the time the cabin came back into view, something had shifted. That evening, Clara moved through the cabin more quietly than before. She folded her things tighter, kept her distance wider. When Jake placed a stool near the hearth for her to sit, she thanked him, but didn't use it. When he offered to carry water, she insisted on doing it herself. Each small refusal built a space between them, careful and deliberate. Jake didn't question it. He didn't close the distance she created. He simply let it exist. And somehow that made it harder, because no matter how far Clara stepped back, Jake remained exactly where he had always been, steady, present, and unwilling to leave. The fire burned low that evening, its glow soft and steady, casting long shadows that moved quietly along the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had settled, but the cold lingered, pressing against the windows like something waiting to be let in. Inside, the silence between Clara and Jake felt different now. Not empty, not unfamiliar, but stretched thin by things neither of them had yet said. Clara sat near the hearth, her hands resting over her belly, fingers lightly curled as if holding herself together. The child shifted again, slower now, heavier. She had begun to notice how each movement carried both comfort and fear, a reminder that time was moving forward whether she was ready or not. Her reflection flickered faintly in the iron kettle hanging above the fire, a distorted version of herself. Older, worn, uncertain. She had never imagined her life bending this way, into someone else's space, someone else's future. Jake moved quietly in the background, stacking wood along the wall with the same measured care he gave everything. His presence filled the room without noise, without demand. There was a steadiness to him that Clara had come to depend on more than she wanted to admit, and that was the problem. "I shouldn't be here," she said suddenly, her voice soft but clear enough to cut through the stillness. Jake paused but didn't turn. "You are." "That's not the same thing." She looked down, her jaw tightening slightly. "You had a life before I showed up. A simple one. I can see it in the way you live. No complications, no—" "Wait." Her hand pressed lightly against her stomach as she said it. Jake set the last piece of wood down and leaned his palm against the table for a moment before facing her. His expression remained calm, but there was something deeper in his eyes now, something less distant. Simple doesn't mean better. Clara let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "It does when you're 28. She lifted her gaze to meet his. "You don't understand what people see when they look at this." She gestured slightly toward herself. "A woman nearly 40, carrying another man's child, living under your roof. That doesn't stay quiet in a place like this." Jake took a step closer, not enough to close the space, but enough to be heard without raising his voice. "I know what they see." "And it doesn't bother you?" she asked, her tone sharper now, though it came from fear more than anger. It's not their life. Clara shook her head slowly. That's easy for you to say. You're not the one they'll talk about years from now. You're not the one who changes everything for someone else. Her voice softened again. I don't want to be the reason your life turns into something you didn't choose. Jake's gaze held hers, steady and unwavering. I did choose. The words landed quietly, but they stayed. Clara felt them settle somewhere deep, somewhere she had been trying to keep untouched. She looked away first, her chest tightening as if the air had grown heavier. A soft sound came from the corner near the door, a low, familiar shuffle. A dog stirred from where it had been lying curled on an old blanket. Duke, a 5-year-old cattle dog with a thick coat of mottled brown and white fur, lifted his head slowly. One of his ears bent slightly at the tip, a mark left from a fight long ago, and his amber eyes carried the calm patience of an animal that had learned to wait rather than chase. Jake had found him injured on the edge of a dry creek years back, and since then the dog had rarely left his side. Duke stretched, then walked toward Clara, his steps unhurried, and rested his head gently against her knee. Clara froze for a moment, then hesitantly lowered her hand, letting her fingers brush through the dog's coarse fur. Duke didn't move away, he simply stayed. Jake watched quietly, then spoke, his voice lower now. He stayed too, didn't have to. Clara swallowed, her fingers still moving absent-mindedly along Duke's neck. That's different. Jake shook his head slightly. Not as much as you think. Silence returned, but it no longer felt like distance. It felt like something shifting, something uncertain but alive. Clara closed her eyes briefly, her thoughts no longer as sharp, no longer cutting in the same way. The fear was still there, of judgment, of burden, of breaking something she hadn't meant to touch, but it wasn't alone anymore. She opened her eyes and looked at Jake again, really looked this time, at the lines shaped by wind and time, at the quiet certainty that had never wavered since the moment he spoke to her on that platform. I don't want you to carry me, she said softly. Jake nodded once. I'm not carrying you. He met her gaze, steady as ever. I'm walking with you. Clara let out a slow breath, something inside her loosening just enough to make space for something new, something fragile, but no longer afraid to exist. The storm came without warning, heavy snow swallowing the land in a matter of hours, turning the world outside into a white silence that felt both endless and unforgiving. Inside the cabin, the air thickened with heat and tension as Clara gripped the edge of the table, her breath uneven, her body tightening with a pain that no longer came and went. It stayed. The first wave had caught her by surprise, but the second left no doubt. It was time. Jake was already moving before she spoke. There was no hesitation in him, no panic in his eyes, only a sharp, focused calm that rose to meet the moment. He cleared the table, laid out what little they had, clean cloth, boiled water, steady hands that did not quite hide the tremor beneath. He had never done this before. That much was clear in the way he checked everything twice, in the way his jaw tightened between breaths. But he didn't step back. He didn't falter. Clara leaned against the wall, her fingers digging into the wood as another contraction tore through her, stronger, deeper. Sweat gathered along her hairline despite the cold pressing against the windows. She had imagined this moment differently once, in another life that now felt like a story told to someone else. There would have been help. There would have been someone older, someone who knew what to do. Instead, there was only Jake, and somehow that was enough. I'm here, he said, his voice low, steady, cutting through the pain. You're not alone. She nodded, though her vision blurred, her thoughts slipping between fear and something else she could not yet name. Each breath became a battle. Each second stretched thin. Duke hovered near the corner, pacing once, then settling, his watchful eyes fixed on Clara as if he understood more than words could hold. Hours passed without measure. Time lost its shape, reduced to effort and endurance. Clara clung to Jake's hand when the pain surged, her grip fierce, unrelenting. He never pulled away. He anchored her with quiet words, repeated not for meaning, but for presence. Stay with me. Just a little more. And then, in a moment that seemed to split the world in two, the pain broke. A cry filled the cabin, small, sharp, alive. Jake froze for half a second, the sound catching him somewhere deep before instinct carried him forward. He wrapped the newborn in cloth with hands that still trembled, but held steady where it mattered. "It's a girl," he said softly, his voice almost disbelieving. Clara reached out, her strength gone but her will intact. When the baby was placed against her chest, something inside her shifted, not broken this time, but mended. Tears slipped quietly down her temples, not from pain, but from the sudden, overwhelming weight of relief. The child moved, small and warm, her tiny fingers curling against Clara's skin as if claiming her place in a world that had almost lost her. "She's here," Clara whispered. Jake nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned to tend the fire, adding wood, keeping the warmth alive as if it were something fragile that needed guarding. The days that followed were quieter, slower. The storm passed, but its imprint remained in the deep drifts outside the cabin. Inside, a different rhythm took hold. Clara moved carefully, her strength returning in pieces, her focus anchored now to the small life in her arms. The baby, whom she named Lily, was soft and pale, with a faint dusting of dark hair and a cry that came quick but faded just as fast, as if she had already learned the world did not require too much noise. Jake adjusted without question. He rose earlier, worked harder, spoke even less, but his presence filled every gap left by uncertainty. He carried Lily when Clara's arms tired, his large hands awkward at first, then more certain, as if learning a language he had never expected to need. Duke followed close behind, watchful, protective, settling near wherever the child rested. When Clara returned to town weeks later, the whispers had not disappeared. But they had changed. Martha still watched, still measured, but her voice had lost some of its edge. Ben said less now, his gaze lingering not on Clara, but on the way Jake held the child without hesitation. People noticed things, not all at once, but enough. That evening, Clara stood outside the cabin, Lily wrapped against her chest, the sky stretched wide above them, pale and endless. Jake stepped out beside her, brushing snow from his gloves. "You ever worry?" she asked quietly, "about what this looks like to them?" Jake glanced toward the distant line of the town, then back at the open land. "Wind talks more than people out here," he said, "but it never stays long enough to matter." Clara let out a soft breath, something lighter than before. She looked down at Lily, then back at him. The fear was still there, somewhere beneath the surface, but it no longer ruled her. The next morning, Clara stepped outside and stopped. There, beside the two chairs Jake had always kept near the door, stood a third. Simple, sturdy, placed with quiet intention, not for the past, but for what came after. In the quiet spaces of life, not all love arrives with promises or perfect timing. Sometimes it shows up when everything feels lost, without asking, without demanding, simply choosing to stay. And maybe that's enough. Maybe being seen, being safe, being allowed to begin again is the kind of miracle we don't talk about often, but recognize when we feel it. In our everyday lives, we all pass by someone standing at their own platform, carrying silent struggles, waiting for something to change. And sometimes the smallest act of kindness, the simplest presence, can become the turning point in someone's story. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a little warmth today. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Your words might be the encouragement someone else is searching for. And if you'd like more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us on this journey. May God bless you. Keep your heart strong in difficult seasons and bring light into the places you thought would stay dark forever.